In 1945, an American defensive line in the Philippines should have collapsed in under 10 minutes. The machine gun was captured. The perimeter was breached. Nearly 200 soldiers were exposed. By doctrine, the position was already lost. But instead of collapsing, it held for exactly 36 minutes. And in those 36 minutes, one U.S. infantryman killed 40 attackers using a single rifle. Not because he was stronger, not because he was better trained, but because he used a small, almost invisible habit that wasn't designed for war at all. A habit that turned reloading into a weapon. This is the story of how a defensive failure became a survival anomaly, and why what worked that morning could never be safely repeated. Numbers stopped making sense. Nothing remarkable about the man standing in that sector of the line. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't a machine gunner by specialty. He wasn't even supposed to be awake. Private First Class John R. McKinney was resting on the ground, 3 paces from a machine gun emplacement that had already done its job for most of the night. Company A had established its defensive perimeter along the coast before sunset. The position wasn't strong, but it was adequate. Overlapping fields of fire, a light machine gun anchoring the sector, riflemen spaced just far enough apart to cover approaches from the jungle. It was the kind of setup infantry manuals described as acceptable under limited threat. The threat, as far as anyone knew, was supposed to be limited. McKinney had been awake most of the night, rotating watch with 2 other soldiers on the M1919. They were exhausted. Everyone was. At 5:27 a.m., the watch rotation ended. Nothing had happened. No probing attacks. No warning shots. No movement detected in the tree line. So McKinney lay back on the ground, rifle across his chest, eyes half open. That was the last moment the situation followed doctrine. Because while the Americans were watching outward, the Japanese had already been inside the perimeter. They had crawled. They had waited. They had measured distance in arm lengths, not meters. And they had chosen their target carefully. The machine gun. The weapon holding the line together. When the first Japanese soldier rose from the darkness, it wasn't with gunfire. It was with a blade. The strike should have been fatal. It wasn't. The saber glanced off McKinney's scalp instead of splitting it. In training, soldiers were taught that survival often came down to seconds. But what saved McKinney wasn't speed. It was familiarity. His hands moved before his brain finished processing pain, sound, or fear. The rifle came up. Not to aim, not to think, just to act. Within moments, the quiet sector turned violent. A shot, then another. The jungle answered back. And suddenly, McKinney was no longer part of a defensive system. He was standing in the place where that system was breaking apart. The machine gun was overrun. The men assigned to it were gone, one wounded, one pulled back. The Japanese did not pause. They turned the captured weapon, and for the first time that morning, the perimeter was truly exposed. From that point on, everything McKinney did would be a reaction to failure, not success. Failure of position, failure of equipment, failure of numbers. What followed would not be a stand planned on a map. It would be 36 minutes of decisions made faster than thought. And every one of those decisions would depend on something McKinney had learned long before the war. In forests, where missing a shot meant going home hungry. The machine gun was never meant to be taken. It was the anchor, the reference point every rifleman aligned around. As long as it fired, the perimeter existed. When it went silent, the line stopped being a line. The Japanese soldiers who reached the emplacement knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't fire wildly. They didn't shout. They moved with purpose. 3 provided cover. The rest closed the final distance. By the time McKinney reached the emplacement, the fight was already over. The machine gun had been physically turned. It was the moment doctrine facing inward. Every manual assumed that a defensive weapon stayed friendly or was destroyed. No chapter covered what to do when it was captured intact and repurposed in seconds. McKinney didn't hesitate. He didn't have time to. He fired into a cluster of men at distances measured in feet, not yards. One fell, then another. The rifle cycled faster than thought. 7 shots in less than 10 seconds. 7 bodies collapsed around the gun. The remaining attackers rushed him. There was no space to step back. No room to reload. So the rifle stopped being a rifle. It became a blunt instrument, wood against bone, steel against muscle. When it was over, the emplacement was a wreck. Blood, spent casings, twisted metal. The machine gun was unusable. But the cost was already paid. The defensive system had lost its core. McKinney stepped back into open ground, breathing hard, blood running down the side of his face. That should have been the end. 10 attackers dead. Averted disaster. Temporarily. But the sound of the fighting had done something far worse. It had announced weakness. From the jungle, movement answered. Not a rush this time. Not shouting. Measured steps. Spacing. Fire discipline. Experienced infantry. They had seen the machine gun fall. They understood what that meant. This wasn't a raid anymore. It was a deliberate effort to break through. McKinney found cover behind a fallen tree, thick enough to stop rifle rounds, but useless against explosives. He checked his rifle. 1 round left. This is where most men would freeze, because this is where the math becomes undeniable. 1 rifle. No automatic weapons. No immediate support. Against dozens, possibly more. But McKinney didn't think in terms of numbers. He thought in sequences. Fire. Reload. Move. That was the habit. Not something he had learned in uniform. Something learned where hesitation cost meals, not lives. He ejected the partial clip. The metal ping echoed louder than the gunfire. It should have given him away. It didn't matter. He loaded again. And when the next group emerged from the tree line, McKinney didn't wait for them to get close. He engaged at distance. 1 fell, then another. The survivors went to ground. Grenades followed. Dirt and wood splintered the air. The enemy was adapting, and so was he. McKinney didn't stay. He never stayed. Every position was temporary. Every pause an invitation for mortar fire. He crawled, shifted, fired again from somewhere else. The perimeter no longer existed as a shape. It existed as a moving point, wherever McKinney happened to be standing. And for the next half hour, that point would decide whether the line held or vanished entirely. What kept the position alive wasn't firepower. It wasn't courage. It wasn't even marksmanship in the way the army defined it. It was something far less dramatic. A habit. McKinney did not reload faster because he was trained to. He reloaded faster because he never thought of reloading as a separate action. In the pine forests of Georgia, missing a moving target meant losing it entirely. There was no second chance. No time to think about mechanics. You fired, you reloaded, you fired again. Not as steps, but as a single motion. That instinct followed him into the jungle. With the M1 Garand, most soldiers treated the reload as a pause. 8 rounds, empty clip. Then stop, reload, resume. McKinney never paused. As soon as the last round left the barrel, the rifle was already coming down. The clip was already ejecting. The next one was already in his hand. He didn't wait for the ping to finish echoing. By the time his brain registered the sound, the rifle was ready again. That mattered. Because the Japanese soldiers advancing through the jungle were still trained on bolt-action rifles, they expected gaps. They expected silence after shots. They expected time. What they didn't expect was a single rifle that kept speaking without rhythm. To them, it sounded wrong. Too fast, too continuous, too confident for one man. That confusion bought seconds. Seconds were everything. McKinney used those seconds to do the one thing doctrine warned against. He kept moving. Every burst of fire was followed by displacement. A few yards, sometimes only a body length. Never enough to retreat. Just enough to break targeting. Japanese grenades landed where he had been, not where he was. Mortar rounds walked in carefully, always late. McKinney didn't outshoot the attackers. He outpaced their decision cycle. Every time they adapted, he was already somewhere else. And slowly, something shifted. The attackers stopped rushing. They began probing. Small groups, wide spacing. More caution. That should have favored them. Instead, it gave McKinney exactly what he needed. Predictability. Each advance followed the same pattern. Tree line, pause, movement. McKinney waited for that pause. He never fired at the first man he saw. He fired at the one who stopped. The one who thought he was safe. 1 shot. Then a second. Then silence. The jungle swallowed the bodies. And the next group hesitated even longer. The reload wasn't the trick. The trick was that McKinney never let the enemy know when the rifle was empty. To them, it never was. By the time reinforcements began moving toward his sector, the attackers were no longer pressing. They were counting losses. They were uncertain. And uncertainty, in a jungle assault, is fatal. By the time the sun began to lift above the tree line, time had stopped behaving normally. The fight no longer felt like minutes passing. It felt like a single, unbroken moment stretched thin. McKinney stopped thinking in clocks. He thought in sequences. Movement. Sound. Pause. Pause. Each Japanese push followed the same shape. And each time, the shape broke in the same place. They came in groups now. Not 10, not 15, 3, 4, sometimes 5. Enough to test. Not enough to commit. That was the danger. Small units forced McKinney to reveal himself more often. Every shot increased the risk of triangulation. Every pause invited explosives. He countered by doing something that looked reckless. He fired first. Not at the closest target, not at the loudest, at the one holding the group together. When that man fell, the others stalled. In that stall, McKinney moved. He never ran. Running drew fire, but less than the time. When stepped, but then their love. McKinney moved, just an excellently worst. McKinney fired everything below. When stepped by the Vallotton Committee is impossible for the next find. The time, he said himself fired in Fledig Bepane. When she said, he completely fired first to evaluate and controlled. McKinney moved distemly, a feeling mat relation. But the restfully, he fired its going on. He commented at the group together. McKinney moved. The others set up is the time ins present on side that they were self-infleted, but they were field in selling the man. McKinney moved. They worked down the story as the close of range. In that stall, he fired first. In that stall, McKinney moved. The first move formed the triangulation, the change from a floor polaire. Because the date, they started pursuited. McKinney moved to general anything at the restival place. In that man fell, when stepped by the Vallotton Committee to fired first together and controlled. When stepped by the Vallotton Committee to change from a floor polaire. McKinney moved. They avoid the peace to rest of us, but less than of the time. McKinney moved, the definitely discovered by the rest of us, but less than the rest of us. But the definitely discovered by the rest of us, but less in the way. In that man fell, they've revealed the triangulation. When stepped by the Vallotton Committee to change from a floor polaire. When stepped by the Vallotton Committee to change from a floor polaire. The Vallotton Committee is based in, but less than of the time. But the definitely discovered by the rest of us, but less than of the time. Because the definitely to trains the rest of us, but less than the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely discovered by the rest of us, but less than the rest of us. When stepped by the Vallotton Committee to change from a floor polaire. When stepped by the Vallotton Committee to change from a floor polaire. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. When stepped by the Vallotton Committee to change from the floor polaire. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. When stepped by the Vallotton Committee to change from a floor polaire. When stepped by the Vallotton Committee to change from the floor polaire. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. Because the definitely to change the rest of us. because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us, because the definitely to change the rest of us. Invited ran. Running drew fire. He walked quickly, low, controlled, just far enough to make the last position irrelevant. Mortar rounds began falling closer now. The enemy had started to understand the pattern. By the time the shells landed, McKinney was already gone. Again and again. Every move cost him something. A little more exhaustion. A little less ammunition. A little less margin. At one position, he realized he had scattered his supplies across 3 separate locations. If he fell back too far, he would lose access to most of it. So he stopped retreating. He chose a place to hold. A termite mound rose from the ground like a low wall. Dense, solid, tall enough to protect a crouched man. From there, McKinney could see everything. The tree line, the open ground, the approaches. It was a perfect position. And a terrible one. If the enemy guessed he was there, it would be the end. 3 soldiers appeared first. Moving fast, sprinting instead of crawling. Speed instead of patience. McKinney fired twice. 2 fell. The third reached cover close enough to throw. The grenade never left the man's hand. The explosion marked the space like a warning. That moment mattered more than any kill, because it told the attackers something they hadn't fully accepted yet. This wasn't a position they were grinding down. This was a man they couldn't pin. At 6:23 a.m., American voices appeared behind him. Reinforcements. Late, but not too late. The final Japanese push stalled, then broke. Survivors pulled back into the jungle, carrying wounded, abandoning weapons. The silence afterward felt unreal. McKinney stayed where he was, rifle loaded, eyes fixed forward. He didn't relax. Men who survived long enough learned that silence could lie. Only when daylight fully exposed the ground did the reality settle. Bodies lay scattered where advances had failed. Near the machine gun, near the tree line, around the termite mound. The count would come later, but the line had held. Not because the defense was strong, because one man had refused to let time slow him down. When the firing finally stopped, no one spoke at first. Silence, after that much noise, felt unnatural. McKinney stayed where he was, rifle loaded, eyes forward. Win of the right for a bloking with power. When the since the drifes was won, but the more word, a made fire waste. McKinney stayed where he was, rifle loaded, eyes forward. The rivers in the horsive came back around the Chapany, but in other words, didn't spoke him. Essentially the drifes was never spaced the drife of former, in right bring the future. McKinney stayed where he was, rifle loaded, eyes forward. When the firing finally stopped, no one spoke at first, because one man had refused to let time slow him down. When the firing finally stopped, no one spoke it forward, into the child. These times push reviews to let time slow him down. The count would come later. When the firing finally stopped, no one spoke it forward, but in other words, didn't spoke him. When the firing finally stopped, no one spoke it forward, because one man had refused to let time slow him down. When the firing finally stopped, no one spoke it forward, because one man had refused to let time slow him down. When the firing finally stopped, no one spoke it forward, because one man had refused to let time slow him down. When the firing finally stopped, no one spoke it forward, because one man had refused to let time slow him down. McKinney stayed where he was, rifle loaded, eyes forward. We teachin' that attacks often returned after quiet. They didn't. As the light strengthened, officers began moving forward from the rear positions. They walked carefully, stepping around churned dirt, shattered branches, spent casings. And bodies. They were everywhere. Near the destroyed machine gun, along the approaches from the jungle, at distances that made no sense for a single defender. A patrol began counting. They counted slowly. 38 near the original position. 2 more beside a mortar crew that never fired. 40. Only confirmed bodies were recorded. Wounded attackers had been dragged away during the withdrawal. The actual number was almost certainly higher. Company A's losses were examined next. 3 killed, 7 wounded. That was all. The battalion commander did the math. If the machine gun had been turned inward for even a few minutes, if the perimeter had folded, the Japanese would have rolled the line from the flank. The entire company would have been exposed. Nearly 200 men, most of them asleep when the attack began. The report did not describe heroism. It described consequences. It noted that one sector remained intact despite complete system failure, that enemy assaults were repeatedly disrupted, that the defensive line never fully collapsed. It also noted something else, that the actions taken during those 36 minutes could not be replicated safely. McKinney had not followed doctrine. He had violated several principles meant to keep soldiers alive. He stayed forward instead of falling back. He engaged alone. He relied on speed where coordination was expected. It worked. Once. Under conditions that could not be recreated on command. That mattered, because armies are built on repeatability. What saved those men at dawn could not become a manual. McKinney was promoted. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor. The citation would later list distances, numbers, time. It would not describe what it felt like to make decisions faster than fear. Or to realize there was no one left between the jungle and the men behind you. Those details don't fit in reports, but they explain everything. What happened that morning created a problem no medal could solve. Because armies are not built on exceptions. They are built on methods that work most of the time, for most people, under most conditions. What McKinney did worked once. That alone made it dangerous. If you tried to teach it, you would kill men. Not because the idea was wrong, but because the margin was microscopic. McKinney succeeded because of conditions that aligned only briefly. The terrain forced the enemy into predictable approaches. The jungle limited visibility. The attackers lacked immediate coordination once their initial plan failed. And McKinney himself possessed something doctrine could not manufacture: the ability to act without hesitation, without visible fear, without slowing down to confirm what instinct already decided. Most soldiers would pause. They would wait for confirmation, for orders, for support. That pause would have been fatal. The army studied the engagement carefully after the war, not to replicate it, but to understand why it could not be repeated. The conclusion was blunt. The reload speed was not the advantage. The movement was not the advantage. Even the marksmanship was not the advantage. The advantage was psychological. McKinney never allowed the enemy to finish a decision cycle. Every time the attackers adapted. Next assumption: that kind of pressure collapses coordination. It turns trained units into individuals, and individuals, under fire, hesitate. This is why attempts to copy similar behavior later failed. Other soldiers tried to stay forward alone. They were surrounded. Others tried to rely on speed over coordination. They ran out of ammunition or cover. Doctrine exists because exceptions kill more men than they save. McKinney survived because he never tried to be exceptional. He simply reacted faster than the situation could stabilize. That is not a skill that can be drilled. It is a condition, one created by background, temperament, exhaustion, fear, and loss of alternatives. The army recognized this quietly. McKinney was honored. But the method was buried. Not out of shame, out of understanding. Years later, when the reports were archived and the citations written, the story became simpler than it really was. 40 attackers killed, 36 minutes, 1 rifle. Numbers are neat. They fit on paper. But numbers don't explain why nearly 200 men walked away from that beach alive. The line didn't hold because of superior firepower. It didn't hold because of better planning. It didn't even hold because of bravery in the way we usually define it. It held because one man never let the situation slow him down. When the system failed, he didn't try to replace it. He didn't try to command it. He didn't try to fix what was already broken. He simply occupied the space where collapse should have happened. For 36 minutes, the jungle did not face a defensive line. It faced a moving problem it could not solve fast enough. McKinney never spoke much about that morning. When asked, he didn't describe tactics. He didn't describe fear. He said he did what needed to be done because stopping wasn't an option. That answer disappointed people looking for meaning, but it was honest. Wars are not won by moments like this. Campaigns are not decided by individuals. But men survive because of them. The difference matters. Somewhere behind McKinney that morning, soldiers slept through the attack. Others woke to gunfire and lived long enough to pull on boots and grab rifles. Some never realized how close they came to dying. They would go on to fight other battles. Some would not survive the war. But they survived that morning, not because the plan worked, because when the plan failed, one man did not. And that is why this story still matters. Not as a lesson to copy, not as a tactic to repeat, but as a reminder of how thin the line can be between order and collapse, and how rarely it holds for reasons anyone expects.